Hello, everyone. This will be a discussion of the Ethical Public Discourse essay now that you're in the drafting stages of the project. The first thought that I want to leave you with here is the fact that this essay is about one and one thing only. That thing is whether the public discourse surrounding a subject of widespread importance is ethical, that is, resulting in a more educated and empowered public and thus benefiting the common good, or unethical, that is, resulting in a more confused and divided public and thus damaging the common good. This is what the essay is out to do. This is what the essay is there to work on arguing for. This is the point that we're making. It's the most important thing, and I can't emphasize that enough. Now, I want to break that down by looking at the way that that statement I just read you about the two possible ways of judging public discourse contains the focus of the essay, the overall point the essay needs to make, and finally also contains the means by which we will analyze the focus of the essay to make that an overall point and to support the point. So, in green, we have the public discourse surrounding a subject of widespread importance. This is our focus. We'll be looking at the way the public discourse has had something to do with, or described, or discussed, or otherwise told us about some subject of widespread importance from the recent history. After that, the overall point the essay needs to make is whether that public discourse was ethical or unethical, thus the reason that you see these things in red. Finally, in yellow, you have the means by which we'll go about analyzing that overall focus to support our point. Basically, we need to show either that we've got that more educated and empowered public, or on the other hand, whether we have that confused and divided public. Consider this then, really, as we look to the Mortimer Sellers essay, Ideals of Public Discourse, we've got to choose what tools are going to work best for us, and we need to think about those tools as being the things that will help us to look at what results in a more educated and empowered public, benefiting the common good, and overall being ethical in that way. Again, I have to emphasize, that's the most important thing. That is the number one purpose of the essay we're writing. So our selection of the tools from Sellers has to be based on what's going to help us to do that the best. To look then at what those tools are, we begin with his concept of public discourse itself. In other words, what is public discourse? And to quote the Sellers essay directly, what speeches, publications, and other statements will we be examining in our essay? After that, we have the, the concept of the common good. In other words, are the common good and private interests coordinated? And does the discourse surrounding the subject help or hinder the coordination of public good and private interests? The next tool we could choose to use is living in a republic. In other words, according to Sellers, are the institutions such as government, educational system, and religion working to protect the common good of the people? Next, we have the tool of civility. In other words, within the public discourse, are participants treated as equals whose, quote, interests deserve respect and whose views merit careful consideration? Next, and the two tools we have here are of particular importance for the Sellers essay and for what we're going to be doing here. We have sincerity. In other words, to what extent is there an actual commitment to serving the common good and therefore sincerity? Or to what extent has insincere discourse, and that is discourse which is not actually in pursuit of the common good, even if it claims to be, been present? Following that, we have outrage. Has there been, on the part of the larger community, a response to insincerity, which often results from small groups within the community working to serve their own purposes rather than those purposes of the community? Has the larger community used its outrage to police and regulate the bounds of what is considered acceptable discourse and what is not considered acceptable discourse? Next, we have to look at whether a community has formed. So in community, Has there been a community formed which serves the common good of all within it? Or, on the opposite, is it possible that we've had the formation instead of tribes and tribalism? Have subcommunities or tribes formed around elements of the identities of members rather than shared characteristics of all the members in the community? If that's happened, which interests of which individual members of the tribes are served before the common good of the community itself is served? Finally, we have toleration. Have there been transgressions against what is acceptable in public discourse? If so, has there been outrage against those transgressions, or were they met with toleration? If there was toleration, was it fair? If there wasn't toleration, was that fair? Has toleration worked to prevent, quote, unnecessary friction by overlooking those violations that do the least harm to public discourse? So the point then is that for any of those conceptual tools that we decide to apply in our own writing, we have to see whether or not those questions are answered, and if so, how they are. Our answers to all of those questions that help us to understand what those tools do will be the things that help us to first decide and then argue for whether or not the public discourse surrounding our subject has been ethical. Let's then take a look at a sample topic and thesis statement to further our discussion of what to do next as we consider which tools from the Sellers essay we're going to apply in our essays. And by the way, you might notice that this thesis statement has been written in the same form as the thesis statements you've seen examples of in the two readings of thesis statements from just earlier this semester. So our sample thesis statement then, quote, one might think that the popular discourse surrounding COVID-19 and the vaccine for it would only benefit the common good. After all, COVID and the pandemic affect everyone. But that discourse does not always benefit the common good, and our understanding of the reasons for this is crucial to the preservation of ethical public discourse regarding anything of widespread importance going forward. Just in case you haven't identified the various moves of the introduction here, I begin with an acknowledgement of what most people would perceive or what most people would think. After that, I go to a statement of the fact that that's not entirely the case or not entirely accurate. And then I give a rationale for why not only is the reader going to want to read what I've got to say afterwards, but also why that's important to the overall understanding of the subject. So let's look then at the tools that we could use in our analysis of the public discourse that has surrounded COVID-19 and its vaccine. Now, for each of these, all I've done is go down the list of tools and made notes about the extent to which I could use those tools in respect to COVID-19 and the discussion of it, and also these sorts of points that I know I could make, even if later on I would need to go forward and look for evidence and examples in the form of probably news journalism and news videos and such. But this stage of the game is still sort of part of the planning and drafting process. All we're looking to do is to see which of these things is the most promising. I'm going to make points for each of these conceptual tools, but that doesn't mean I'm going to use them all. I'm just looking for what I've got the most to say about. So for the issue of ideal public discourse itself, this is the one tool that absolutely everybody across the board will have to use. I'll have to ask here, well, has public discourse around COVID-19 and its vaccine universally resulted in a more educated, unified public? No, absolutely not. Unfortunately, even though we should all be working together on this problem because of the overall size of the problem, there's actually been significant public division specifically because of the ways that this has been talked about publicly. Next, we have the concept of public discourse itself. Well, what does this discourse consist of for what we'll be doing? It's articles, video footage, speeches by political leaders, including the president and other prominent lawmakers. And given my own knowledge of recent events, I'll also be taking a look at public speeches and policy changes from the governors and leaders in Texas. Next, we have the concept of the common good. The public good and private good here are not coordinated. And we can see a really clear example of that in the ongoing and brutal conflict between the government in the state of New York and small business owners who are fighting to open back up at full capacity. Specifically, this happened in relation to gyms earlier during the pandemic. This serves to obfuscate the matter of what the actual health risks are in public places. We have all of these fairly prominent owners of small businesses saying that they see no reason whatsoever to stay closed. And in that way, the implication is that for some reason, those places are simply safer than others. However, on the other hand, at the state level, we have the governor himself and various state and health leaders who are telling us that actually it's not safe to be in public places that have that many people around us. Next, we have the question of what it means to live in a republic. Well, this breaks down to the various institutions of the republic. We can say that the government at the state level seems to be working to protect the common good. However, conflicts, exist at the level of school systems about whether or not it is safe to open back up to students full time. On the one side, oftentimes there are parents, specifically outspoken parents, and also perhaps school boards and administrators in school buildings. And on the other side are oftentimes teachers and teachers' unions. The first side is arguing that it's safe and we need to put students back in school full time. The side after that, or the other side, that is the teachers and teachers' unions, are arguing that they don't feel that it's safe enough yet. Right. So, in this way, then, the conflict that we're seeing in the institutions of the republic we live in are ones that are not making it any easier for us to be further educated and empowered in a way that would allow us to act on this question of the pandemic and what to do about it. Next, we have to question how much civility versus incivility do we have? There's a real problem here. Actions and statements of groups who deny the existence of COVID-19 and who oppose vaccines, as well as those who oppose mask wearing, oftentimes demonstrate a complete lack of civility in their unwillingness to acknowledge other viewpoints. Next, in sincerity and outrage, right? Again, these are the tools from sellers that allow us to gauge the extent to which there is actual commitment to working for the public good, as well as allowing us to gauge and then describe those reactions by the public against things that they view as completely unacceptable for the discourse that gets conducted and for the basic actions people take. Right. So, in terms of sincerity, well, most entities have pledged to help the public in this time of COVID-19, and they've shown themselves willing to do so. However, we do have governmental agencies who at one time claim to understand that there is still danger, but at the same time also strongly support opening up fully. Right. And we can look at the lack of sincerity here in being the kind of friction or conflict between the two of those messages. For outrage, public outrage has been in response to a perceived lack of preparation for the pandemic by government entities and on behalf of those groups of people who've been affected and even killed by COVID 19, who are commonly referred to as most at risk. And oftentimes these are the elderly, these are also people with pre existing health conditions. Finally, and this is an interesting quirk of the public discourse surrounding COVID 19, public outrage is formed in response to the overall number of COVID related deaths in the US, currently at more than 500,000. Right. So, what we have here is public outrage coalescing at the figure itself and what that means, even if not necessarily at every single death. This point is usually by comparing the number of deaths from COVID 19 to the number of deaths in wars of the 20th century. And again, we can see the way that that comparison would be specifically designed to make the point that the number is very large. In terms of community, we have seen the formation of community, and we've seen that these communities have been strengthened through their efforts to support all members during the struggles resulting from COVID 19. This has actually been a very nice, reassuring part of the pandemic. However, on the other side, we've also seen some problems with tribes and tribalism. Some of this has resulted from the early distribution of the vaccine when the earliest doses were only available to a select few. This resulted in hyper-awareness of the shared characteristics in that select few, which made people eligible for the vaccine, but also set them apart from those other members of the community who were not yet eligible. The problems between the two of those, the resentment, in fact, that formed between the two of those tribes, was directly responsible for the lack of civility between them and a real breakdown in public discourse at the beginning moments of this year when the vaccines were first made available. Last, to look at toleration, the COVID-19 pandemic has been marked by little toleration of any actions that might put one person's well being in danger due to another person's lack of consideration or want of convenience. Conflicts between complete strangers, in fact, in public settings caused by one person wearing a mask and the other not, or even by the other person simply not wearing their mask as fully and completely as the first person would like, are certainly evidence of this. Now, I've gone through those 10 things, but I want to stress the same thing that I did going into them. Having gone through each of those 10 tools from the seller's essay doesn't mean I'm going to use them all. Instead, then, right, for each of the tools we know we could use, we want to conduct a brief search on the internet, and the school databases of newspapers would be a fantastic way to do this because, of course, you're not going to get hit by any paywalls going through the school databases, right? So we want to do a brief search through those to see if the information we need as evidence for the points we want to make exists and is accessible to us, right? If we've gone through this kind of content generation, we now have a lot of possibilities, but we can only afford to use those ones that we know we're going to be able to support and back up with evidence from actual things that have happened publicly out there in the real world. Finally, then, whatever overlap exists between the points we know that we could make and the evidence we know we could access and use, that's what dictates the essay we'll write. To sum up, then, I've got a couple of things that I'd encourage everybody to remember as they write. Number one, it's all about whether the public discourse, that is, statements that are published or made publicly, has been ethical in its ability to make the public more educated and empowered, or has been unethical in its potential to make the public more confused and more divided. And this should sound very familiar. I harped on this at the beginning of this video discussion. Two, showing something to be true by discussing a real-world example will always, and I can't stress this enough, always, always, always be more effective than simply stating it yourself and hoping no one questions it. Number three, quote outside sources to include ideas from important statements and short passages. Paraphrase important longer passages for the ideas you need from them. Cite them both with the author's last name, the year of publication, and the page number wherever possible. Finally, two more. One, ask yourself, of every point you make, will my reader know why I'm making them read this? Please remember that the reader who has started to wonder why they have to read what they're reading is the reader who is in real danger of becoming skeptical. The skeptical reader is the one who is now more looking for faults on our part by virtue of the writing we've done versus the possible mistakes we've made in that writing. And they're just no longer as focused on our ideas as they used to be. We don't want that. That's the last thing we need. Writing is hard enough without a reader who is actively looking for mistakes we've made. We need our reader to be looking at the ideas and following the ideas. So again, we need to make sure that that rationale, that reason that the reader's reading every single point has to be so abundantly clear that there's never a moment they've got to ask themselves if they remember why. And the last thing, and I'm kind of proud of this one, remember, ladies and gentlemen, this is a reason to proofread. Mistakes are like snowflakes. You like that? I didn't realize it rhymed until after I wrote it. A few are excusable and easy to see through, but when those mistakes start to pile up, they get impossible to see through and can even keep the reader from moving forward. So at almost 20 minutes, I'm going to finish this thing off. Thank you all for following me through this, and I hope it's been helpful. Please continue working on the drafting and revision of your essays, and let me know if there are any further problems. I'll do my best to help. Goodbye, everybody.